Hello everyone, please take a seat. The conference is about to start. President and the UNESCO Director-General should be arriving anytime.
Por favor, tomen asiento.
Could you please take a seat? It won't be long for the conference to start. We're waiting for the President and the Director General of UNESCO.
Hello. Hello, everyone. Please. The conference is about to start. There's a short delay, but the President and the UNESCO Director-General should be arriving anytime.
Como habrán notado, hay un pequeño atraso.
As you may have observed, there is a small delay. Could you please take a seat? The conference is about to start.
Hello, everyone. Please take a seat. The conference is to start. The President and the UNESCO Director-General are arriving. Please take a seat.
Están todos sentados. La conferencia está por empezar.
The conference is about to start. We're just waiting for the President and the Director-General of UNESCO who are here. Thank you. Please take a seat.
Hello, everyone. We're about to start. We have a special message from the UN Secretary-General and the High Commissioner of Human Rights.
It is a pleasure to address the global conference marking World Press Freedom Day. And I thank the government of Uruguay and UNESCO for organizing this event. On World Press Freedom Day, we shine a spotlight on the essential work of journalists and other media workers who seek transparency and accountability from those in power, often at great personal risk. Throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, many media workers have been on the front lines, providing accurate, science-based reporting to inform decision makers and save lives. At the same time, journalists who cover climate, biodiversity, and pollution have succeeded in bringing global attention to this triple planetary crisis. But the threats to the freedom of journalists and media workers are growing by the day. From global health to the climate crisis, corruption and human rights abuses, they face increased politicization of their work and attempts to silence them from many sides. Digital technology has democratized access to information, but it has also created serious challenges. The business model of many social media platforms are based not on increasing access to accurate reporting, but on increasing engagement, which often means provoking outrage and spreading lies. Media workers in war zones are threatened not only by bombs and bullets, but by the weapons of falsification and disinformation that accompany modern warfare. They may be attacked as the enemy, accused of espionage, detained or killed, simply for doing their jobs. Digital technology also makes censorship even easier. Many journalists and editors around the world are at constant risk of their programs and reports being taken offline. And digital technology creates new channels for oppression and abuse. Women journalists are at particular risk of online harassment and violence. UNESCO found that nearly 3 in 4 women respondents had experienced online violence. Hacking and illegal surveillance also prevent journalists from doing their jobs. The methods and tools change, but the goal of discrediting the media and covering up the truth remains the same as ever. And the results are also the same. People and societies that are unable to distinguish fact from fiction and can be manipulating in horrifying ways. Without freedom of the press, there are no real democratic societies. Without freedom of the press, there is no freedom. The United Nations is working to support journalists and media workers everywhere. 10 years ago, we established a plan of action on the safety of journalists to protect media workers and end the impunity for crimes committed against them. On World Press Freedom Day, we honor the essential work of the media in speaking truth to power, exposing lies, and building strong, resilient institutions and societies. We call on governments, media organizations, and technology companies everywhere to support these crucial efforts. Thank you.
Greetings to all. I am pleased and honored to participate in this vital conference. Today, we acknowledge the courage and determination of journalists. We pay tribute especially to those who have a little choice but to work amidst ever-increasing harassment, intimidation, surveillance, and risk to their lives and livelihoods. They do so for the sake of all of us, so that we have access to free, accurate, and independent information, so that we can live in just and peaceful societies. Their work helps hold governments accountable and to build the foundation for some of the fundamental human rights we shall enjoy: freedom of opinion, information, and expression. Yet, despite the crucial role in society, journalists continue to operate under grave threat, whether in conflict zones, in countries with restricted civic space or high levels of organized crime, and even in so-called safe and democratic spaces, their security is increasingly at risk. Last year, we saw the number of journalists detained worldwide rise to 293. Legal proceedings are also increasingly being used against investigative journalists to obstruct their work. And as UNESCO described, although the number of reported killings of journalists reduced last year to 55 deaths, impunity remains widespread. A shocking 87% of murders since 2006 remain unresolved. Colleagues, this year's World Press Freedom Day highlights the very real threat that surveillance poses to journalists' work. Rising use of surveillance tools such as the Pegasus or Candiru spyware intrudes deeply into people's devices and lives. Pegasus spyware is reportedly being used in at least 45 countries, often in total secrecy and outside of any legal framework. Such tools are an affront to the right to privacy and an obstruction to freedom of expression. The use of spyware has led to arrests, intimidation, and even killings of journalists. It has endangered their sources. It has put their families at risk. To counter this risk, journalists are often forced to take the dangerous path of self-censorship. New and rapidly evolving surveillance methods pose a raft of risks and challenges, but we must recall that we have a legal foundation to respond to them. The International Human Rights Framework, in particular the International Covenant on Political and Civil Rights, provides such a foundation. The UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights also provides a framework for the private section, including for private surveillance companies. Today, however, countries are failing journalists by failing to enforce these frameworks. We are seeing a rapid rise in the international sale of surveillance tools, with the market thriving due to lack of regulations and controls. In my recent call for a moratorium on this, I stated that until human rights safeguards are in place, we must stop the export, sale, transfer, and use or servicing of privately developed surveillance tools. I thank the organizations and states who have supported this moratorium, as well as the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, who has advocated strongly for it to be implemented. I urge states who purchase or use surveillance technology to do so in accordance with human rights standards. They must ask three crucial questions in this assessment. Are the tools legal? Are they necessary? Are they proportional to any risk? Domestic laws must only permit their use if they meet a legitimate goal. They must also recognize the right to remedy and should maintain strong and independent oversight measures. States also need to establish mechanisms to regulate the purchase and supply of surveillance technologies. They must ensure companies themselves are accountable. This can be done by implementing requirements for them to be transparent in the design and use of surveillance products and to carry out robust human rights due diligence. Respecting human rights is not just the duty of states. I encourage private surveillance companies to publicly affirm their responsibility to respect freedom of expression and privacy, to undertake human rights due diligence, and to carry out transparent reporting on their activities. Crucially, this should be done in regular consultation with civil society. Colleagues, this event gives us the occasion to reflect upon these challenges and to share good practices and solutions. It presents us with an opportunity to take concrete actions to promote a free and independent press, one of the best tools we have to combat disinformation, build public trust, and protect and promote human rights. By tackling the threats of surveillance to journalists, we will be fortunate enough to hear and read about the realities of our world, whether in all of its tragedy, its chaos, or its glory, without risk or danger to the people who are bringing us the stories. To all the journalists present today and to all journalists working around the world, often under perilous circumstances, I honor your brave commitment to provide us truth. Thank you for the work that you do.
Ahora invitamos a los coanfitriones.
We now invite the co-sponsors, the Director-General of UNESCO, Audrey Azoulay, and the President of the Oriental Republic of Uruguay, Mr. Lacalle Pou.
Bienvenidos, bienvenidas todas a esta
Welcome everybody to this World Conference of World Freedom Day, Press Freedom Day. Thank you for receiving us in this beautiful city of Punta del Este, Uruguay. I'm Dario Klein. I'm a journalist. I'm not very sure what I'm doing here. I work for CNN.
For Al Jazeera English.
El tema principal de esta conferencia
Main topic of this lecture conference is journalism under digital siege, a topic we suffer throughout the world. This will be debated in over 70 sessions during these 3 days with over 300 speakers from all over the world. We will have informative activities, launching of new studies, opportunities for funding, and journalist and data protection activities, among other surprises for you.
Conference. We've already just heard the messages by Antonio Guterres, the United Nations Secretary General, and by Michelle Bachelet, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, who both underlined the importance of the fundamental right to free expression and press freedom. So please take this conversation online on your social media with the hashtag World Press Freedom Day. Thank you.
y ahora le solicito a la directora general de la UNESCO, Audrey Azoulay, que es su discurso.
Now request Mrs. Azoulay to give her inaugural address.
Señor Presidente de la
Mr. President of the Oriental Republic of Uruguay, ministers, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. President of the General UNESCO Conference, ladies and gentlemen, friends, hello everybody. It's an honor and a true pleasure to celebrate this day together with you in this exceptional context in Uruguay, Punta del Este, here in this country where there is liberty, in a republic that has enshrined in the Constitution that it is wholly free in all matters of communication of thoughts and press, a country that has been considered in the international classification as at a high level for freedom of press, a country that was committed over a year ago at a time of great uncertainty at health level to organize together with us UNESCO this World Conference for World Press Freedom Day after the last lectures held in Windhoek, Hague, Addis Ababa, and before at Accra. This commitment with international cooperation and freedom of press confirms once again the unique place that Uruguay holds in the community of nations and as a friend of UNESCO. I likewise wish to greet the presence of several coordinators, resident coordinators of the UN that have come from the region, demonstrating the system's commitment, the UN system's commitment with these systems. Being here is also a great responsibility, defending freedom that is a pillar for democratic societies in a world that has been shaken by the explosion of digital technology in our lives. And I say a pillar because the seal of democracies is seeking solutions through a discussion with arguments, not by force. This requires discussion based on demonstrated and verified facts. And these spaces cannot exist without an independent press and professional journalism. And we're aware of the value of verified, free and independent information in a world that is shaken by crises starting from pandemics up to the current conflicts. We must also measure it in the era of the digital revolution. Information has never been so available the journalistic research hasn't had so much scope before, but perhaps never before so covered or even exhausted. In the digital era, we must renew our commitment in UNESCO with free and independent information. And in our organization, this commitment has led us for over 75 years to act in the field supporting journalists. UNESCO offers training so they can work in a safer way. We also contribute to establish specific protection mechanisms for journalists in the different member states and support all players that safeguard freedom of the press. And for the past 10 years now, we have trained over 20,000 judges and judiciary players in this area to apply the action plan of the UN, and together with Latin America and the Caribbean as a pioneer region in this program, more particularly here in Uruguay. And in this framework, I would like to greet the presence of the President of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, Mr. Pérez Manrique, a friend of UNESCO in this work conducted with the judiciary field. But with digital technology, challenges and risks have changed. Among them, I observed two that pose a matter of the possibility of effective freedom of the press, safety of journalists, and feasibility at economic level of the media.
The digital era, of course, has brought new opportunities for journalists in terms of finding new sources, collaborating on investigations, and analyzing large quantities of data, maybe like never before. But especially during this conference, we will also focus on how it can also amplify threats and challenges for journalists and journalism. Surveillance software, data retention, and online intimidation are creating new risks. And this is especially true for women. According to our research, 3 in 4 female journalists have already experienced online harassment. And this digital violence, as we know, can precede and even perpetuate and create physical violence, sometimes with deadly consequences. According to our data, a total of 884 journalists lost their lives just for doing their jobs between 2012 and 2021. And in almost 9 in 10 cases, these murders go unresolved and still unpunished. Violence against journalists is also a violent attack on our freedom. Unfortunately, today, current events remind us just how dangerous being a journalist can be, especially in war zones where they are needed the most. I would here like to pay tribute to the 9 journalists who have been killed while reporting on the conflict in Ukraine. UNESCO stands side by side with journalists there, providing personal protection equipment so they can stay safe and work while reporting, and supporting also national journalist unions. Later today, this year, UNESCO's Guillermo Cano World Press Freedom Prize will also be an opportunity to commemorate the sacrifices made by journalists around the world to defend press freedom, including through this year's laureate, the Belarusian Association of Journalists. But journalists are not the only one individually threatened by digital technology. Media outlets are also at risk. With so much information flooding the digital landscape, the value of professional journalism goes unperceived and very often unpaid for. When data is the new currency, there is an illusion that everything must be free of charge, with catastrophic results for the economic viability of media. According to our data, just in 5 years, the advertising revenues of print newspapers have been cut in half. And at the same time, 2 digital giants receive over half of global digital advertising income. This is extremely, of course, detrimental to the financial and therefore editorial independence of journalism, and we have to rethink the economic models of professional journalism. The Windhoek Declaration that was collectively adopted last year in Namibia in the same World Day, which has also been endorsed by UNESCO's General Conference last November, this Windhoek Declaration charts our path forward. Firstly, it deals with this issue of media viability by working towards a fairer distribution of revenue. This year, UNESCO is launching national consultations with all actors to identify appropriate financing models. Also, this declaration seeks to strengthen media and information literacy, because we need more than ever this kind of education to be part of the 21st century education. We need more critical thinking, more awareness of how information works in the digital era, more appreciation of professional journalism, so that the citizens of tomorrow and of today can navigate overwhelming flows of information. This is probably the most structural way to deal with these new flows of information. UNESCO is making this new media and information literacy a priority. Last year, we launched a revised media and information literacy curriculum, which allows teachers to take ownership of this subject in a world of algorithms and echo chambers. And we've already begun training with this new curriculum over 420 educational institutions. Also, the Windhoek Declaration calls for greater transparency and responsibility for online platforms. We published, after extensive consultation, we published last year transparency principles for digital platforms on algorithms, on content moderation, and on personal data gathering. And this transparency should be a first step. Faced with the preeminence of digital giants, regulating hate speech and disinformation becomes a subject of public interest. We cannot leave it to the private companies to resolve this existential issue themselves, as their business models will continue to favor engagement and clicks at sometimes any cost, prioritizing sensational content over verified information. In particular, decisions must not be based upon the financial or even political interests of such platforms. This would lead to geographic and linguistic inequalities around the world, as at UNESCO we see too often. These issues and actors are global. We therefore need global discussion. And this is why UNESCO can and will be a platform for these discussions. In the coming months, we will invite regulators, media outlets, and civil society actors, as well as platforms, of course, and digital actors, to join the debate to collectively define on a global scale what this common regulation should look like, with freedom of expression and human rights always serving as our compass. And in February 2023, we will hold a global conference to present the conclusions and the progress made on these issues. Señor Presidente, Excelencias,
Mr. President, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, freedom of press is not just an individual freedom for each journalist. It is the freedom of us all, freedom for everyone, that makes it possible to establish democratic dialogue. Therefore, thanks to Uruguay for organizing this celebration, these conversations, and once again reinforcing their commitment to this commission. Thank you very much, and I hope we have a very fruitful day. Thank you. I now have the honor to welcome the host country. Thank you for inviting us to such a nice country, the President of Uruguay, Mr. Luis Lacalle Pou. Good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you all in our country. Going back in time, a little bit over a year ago, the Minister of Education and Culture, Pablo da Silveira, and this Undersecretary, Ana Ribeiro, they have their office next to mine, where we reached different agreements and we discussed, and they were claiming for the opportunity, requesting the opportunity to host the event here. It sounds very easy now to organize it, but go back to 1 year ago and remember where we were 1 year ago, especially in Uruguay. And you might know what the situation was like with regards to the pandemic in Uruguay. It was easier, it would have been easier to give up on that opportunity. Fortunately, the Ministry of Education and their authorities are very stubborn, and here we are. Uruguay has hosted many events, cultural events, sports events, because we've always known that there is a future, that the day after always comes, that even though we were undergoing critical times for the entire humankind, but we were going to surpass that, and this is proof of this. I hope you have the chance to stay a few days in our country. I hope you can enjoy what I think is the best country in the world, the most beautiful country, and we have a great impact thanks of our landscape, our geography, but what I call particularly human geography. When you travel somewhere, unless you have someone who you know, who you love, who can show you around, who's a good host, you'll probably not enjoy that trip as much. And the big difference, what makes our country special is its people. In the few minutes that we can get distracted from our day-to-day agenda after this meeting today, I will already go back to answering WhatsApp messages and going back to my day-to-day obligations. We should speak about important things. That doesn't mean that urgent matters are not important, but maybe we have a bit more time to discuss those issues that are important, and I have no doubt that you will discuss very important matters in the next few days. Just simply let me make some observations as to how I see this topic. From my own perspective, I cannot put myself in a journalist's shoes or a media outlet director, or even, although I try to, the perspective of regular citizens. My perspective is that of a politician leader who, of course, is tempted to seeking control. I think that we are experiencing a change in a different era that is very stimulating and it's very attractive, and we are now faced with a horizontal communication between citizens and authorities. And that challenges us. It pushes us. On top of that, in the past, we had message emitters and recipients. The larger side were on the receiving side, or if they were cultured enough to address that message. We are all emitters and we are all receivers. You just need to be in the right place at the right time to either become the receiver end of breaking news. And many times we fail to recognize or to manage that piece of news because we do not have the education or background. That's why we have professional journalists to do so. So in this new era, a new era of micro power, anyone who has a cell phone in their hands has power in their hands if they have an audience. We need to provide certainties to journalists and the entire profession. It is not just about freedom of expression or opinion, which of course is critical, but it is about freedom to work. Audrey just mentioned sustainable media. And we have some horizontal maps that are very important for us as Uruguayans. It is when we listen to international media outlets, or we read, or we watch on TV. And then on the other end, we have the local media. I truly believe that local media are extremely important to sustain and preserve our culture and idiosyncrasy. And I'm not just talking about national media outlets, but really local or smaller media outlets. A small radio station in a little province in Uruguay. Fray Marcos is a very small town in Uruguay, and then you get to know everything that happens around the Fray Marcos town. So in this era of globalization, having access to the information in our own town, in our city, is very important. Sometimes we hear about what goes on in other parts of the world, and we fail to be informed to what happens in our region, which is essential to exercise our democratic rights. Another thing that challenges, particularly journalists more than politicians, is the immediacy of news. Modern journalists need to render news immediately, even and beat the others, do it before. So you have no chance to analyze, to prepare that piece of news. You just need to publish. And once it's out there, it's out there. And that's why ethics in journalism is increasingly important. Because on the other hand, we will have protection of honor, privacy, and the privacy of individuals. So those tensions, or in between these two ends, will have authorities, the executive, the legislature, and that's where temptation comes into play. Authorities are tempted to say, we will not regulate. We will not go on that regulatory path. I believe, and Audrey and I just discussed this in a private meeting before, that our capacity to educate citizens to learn how, to what extent get involved with certain news is essential. Otherwise, we're attempting to cover the sun with our thumb. I love the era we live in. I think that we are blessed how much information we have available. Every time someone asks me or talks to me about controlling or regulating, I first say no, and then I think about it, because I consider it is an essential pillar for democracy. I think information is essential for democracy, and the role of journalists is as well. Events like this are very, very important for that very same reason. This is why events like this should help us all understand the new reality. I am 48 years old, so I am the in-between generation, in between our children and our parents, and everything has changed so fast. Fake news in Uruguay, there is a saying that says that something is very old, and the gossip or hearsay has always existed. And it was more popular to sell that piece of news. But of course, news in the past would unfold more slowly. Rumors, gossip, and fake news nowadays, once it's out there and you try to challenge it, well, it's too late. There is a large part of our population that is willing to believe that that is true. And that's when, as we discussed earlier, when AI comes into play, algorithms and neuroscience. Because if there is AI and algorithms, it's because there is a brain behind it that is willing to be led in those circumstances. I don't know if you're familiar with the communication lobes between internet communication sites, Twitter, or they are parallel worlds.
with the exception of curious people and journalists, and that's really a contradiction because journalists are curious, are generally ecosystems that have a few coincidences. So how to break with that rationale that is clearly contributed to by AI? And once again, I repeat, it's through education. And that is why, apart from welcoming you and being so happy to have Uruguayan journalists and people related to this task listening and giving their views, during these days, it is extremely important for us to stop for a while. And the first definition of freedom of press is a respect for the profession of journalists, making the media sustainable vis-à-vis the siege with this new digital press, adapting, of course, and from government in Uruguay. I'm sure this has been the case throughout and will be so in the future. General and unrestricted respect to responsible freedom. Thank you.
Bueno, ahora vamos a...
Now, let us enjoy from a show, a tango show from the juvenile orchestra under conductor Moreira.
Inscribed in UNESCO's Intangible Heritage List.
Invitamos a la...
We invite the Director-General and the President to see the show together with the audience.
Estamos muy presentados.
Hello, everyone. Please remain seated as the tango show is going to begin soon.
Mientras la orquesta y el ballet se prepara, las autoridades nacionales se están retirando, está por empezar.
muñeca, muñequita, que habla con seta y que con gracia posta a ti dice que con tus aspavientos de pandereta sos la milonguerita de Chile, trajeada de bacana, bailas con corte y por nuestro ritmo tomás mi sed y que en un autocamba esta noche hacías como una dama de gran calle. Chepa puso a oír los acordes melodiosos que modula el bandoneón. Chepa puso a oír los latidos angustiosos de tu pobre corazón. Chepa puso a oír cómo surgen de este tango los pasajes de tu ayer. Siempre el flujo del ambiente, hoy te arrastran la corriente, mañana te quiero ver, longuerita linda. Vamos en breva con ojos almendrados de pipermine, de parra franchutada, pinta maleva, mi boca pecadora, color carmín, engrumpen tus alhajas en la milonga, con fino faroleo brillante y al bailar esos tangos de meta y conga, volvés otario al vivo y al reneguí. Chepa puso a oír los acordes melodiosos que modula el bandoneón. Chepa puso a oír los latidos angustiosos de tu pobre corazón. Chepa puso a oír cómo surgen de este tango los pasajes de tu ayer. Siente el rojo del ambiente, hoy te arrastra la corriente, mañana te quiero ver. Rechiflao en mi tristeza, te evoco y veo que has sido en mi pobre vida paria solo una buena mujer. Tu presencia de bacana puso calor en mi nido, fuiste buena, consecuente, y yo sé que me has querido, como no quisiste a nadie, como no podrás querer. Se dio el juego de remanche cuando vos, pobre percanta, gambeteabas la pobreza en la casa de pensión. Hoy sos toda una bacana, la vida te ríe y canta. Los morlacos del otario los tiras a la marchanta, como juega el gato maula con el mísero ratón. Hoy tenés el mate lleno de infelices ilusiones, te engrupieron los otarios, las amigas, el gavión. La milonga entre magnates con sus locas tentaciones, donde triunfan y claudican milongueras pretensiones, se ha entrado muy adentro en el pobre corazón. Nada debo agradecerte, mano a mano hemos quedado, no me importa lo que has hecho, lo que haces, ni lo que harás. Los favores recibidos, creo habértelos pagado. Y si alguna deuda chica sin querer se me ha olvidado, en la cuenta del otario que tenés se la cargas. Mientras tanto que tus triunfos, pobres triunfos pasajeros, sean una larga fila de riquezas y placer. Que el bacán que te acamala tenga pesos duraderos, que te abraza en las paradas con cabellos milongueros, y que digan los muchachos, es una buena mujer. Y mañana cuando seas descolado mueble viejo y no tengas esperanzas en el pobre corazón, si precisas una ayuda, si te hace falta un consejo, acordate de este amigo que ha de jugarse el pellejo para ayudarte en lo que pueda cuando llegue la ocasión. Vencido con el alma amargada, sin esperanzas, saciado de la vida, solloza en su bulina el pobre payador, sin hallar un consuelo a su dolor. Colgada de un clavo la guitarra, en un rincón la tiene abandonada, de su sonido ya no le importa nada. Tirado en la catrera, no hace más que llorar. Y en alguna ocasión solo se escucha esta canción. Mocosita, no me dejes morir, volve al cotorro, que no puedo vivir. Si supieras las veces que he soñado, que de nuevo te no me seas tan cruel, no me abandones, quiero verte otra vez. Mocosita, no me dejes, que me mata poco a poco tu desdén. Mi mocosita, no me dejes morir, vuelve al cotorro, que no puedo vivir. Si supieras las veces que he soñado, que de nuevo te tenía a mi lado. Mi mocosita, no me seas tan cruel, no me abandones, quiero verte otra vez. Mocosita, no me dejes, que me mata poco a poco tu desdén.
Ahora. Muchas gracias a los artistas. Ahora.
We want to thank the artists. Now we will allow people to reorganize the room to have our opening talk show.
Journalism under digital siege. Thank you so much for our guests who have been waiting online. Among them is Will Cathcart, head of WhatsApp, connected from Menlo Park in California. Timnit Kibru, founder and executive director of the Distributed Artificial Intelligence Research Institute, and Shoshana Zuboff, Harvard professor emeritus, connected from Cambridge in Massachusetts. Professor Zuboff, thank you so much for being with us. One of your masterpieces and bestseller is The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, two words that have to do with the current crisis independent media are experiencing. Recent developments in surveillance by state and non-state actors have been proved to be a major threat to the freedom and safety of investigative journalists around the world, while the viability of the current media model is challenged by the evolution of capitalism and by the business models of big tech companies. This World Press Freedom Conference has an overall theme, which is journalism under digital siege. This is to spotlight the multifaceted ways in which technology and means of surveillance, as well as big data collection and artificial intelligence, impact journalism, freedom of expression, and privacy. Also to be discussed are the associated challenges to media viability in digital times and threats to public trust that arise from surveillance and digitally mediated attacks on journalists. We would like you to navigate us on what are the technological developments and how they impact on both the universal right to freedom of expression and the work of journalists.
Of course, I want to thank our organizers and our hosts of this seminal meeting. Special greetings and thanks to El Presidente. It's an honor to share this event with you. And of course, to UNESCO Director-General Audrey Azoulay. Welcome, Your Excellencies. And to all those who are joining us in Punta del Este. I certainly wish I could be in Uruguay right now. And to those who are joining us around the world. It's easy to forget that just 2 decades ago, barely 25% of the world's information was digital. Today, nothing escapes this web. It is our shared fate and our privilege to live at the dawn of information civilization. But what kind of future will this be? What legacy will we leave to our children, our people, and the generations beyond? In an information civilization, our lives are rendered as and mediated by information. But what is the quality of this information? Who knows this information? Who decides who knows this information? And who decides who knows? These are the essential questions of knowledge, authority, and power that now define our social order. In this year of 2022, across so many of our societies, it is the surveillance capitalist firms, beginning with the giants, Google, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, and their ecosystems, that hold the answers to each of these questions, though we never elected them to govern. In a mere 2 decades, surveillance capitalism grew from baby startups into a global institutional order, intermediating virtually all human engagement with digital architectures across every domain of everyday life. The giants and their ecosystems now own all the data about all the people. And they own the data science and the scientists, the cables, computers, and clouds. They control the global market in knowledge production, known as artificial intelligence and machine learning. They decide what becomes knowledge, who knows it, and to what purpose. The question is, how did this happen? From the dawn of the World Wide Web in the mid-1990s, the liberal democracies failed. They failed to construct a coherent political vision of a digital century that advances democratic values, principles, and governance. This failure left a void where democracy should be. That void was most extreme in America, my country, where an ideology of radical market freedom persuaded lawmakers to consign the new networked information and communication spaces to private control, while diminishing democratic prerogatives and power. America's fledgling internet startups quickly filled the void with a novel digital age economics of surveillance capitalism based on the secret capture and datafication of human experience. Such taking without asking is normally called theft. And it was on the strength of this theft that human data were aggregated on an industrial scale and claimed as the corporate property of the companies, available for new methods of computation, behavioral prediction, and sales. The first breakthrough, famously, was the click-through rate that revolutionized online advertising with surveillance-based targeting. Surveillance capitalism now, however, reorders every domain of economic activity. When human data are hunted prey, a great deal of bait must be continuously set into the trap. The bait was also part of the big taking, including all the web pages, all the books, the music, the bodies, the cars, shops, homes, classrooms, hospitals, maps of all the territories, streets, buildings, houses, and all the news. The more bait, the more engagement. Then the more data extraction and the more predictions and the more revenues. Most critical to understand here for us gathered today is the fate of information under surveillance capitalism and its debasement of journalism and of journalists. These vast machine systems are designed to treat information as a bulk commodity, like tons of wheat or barrels of oil. They are built for volume production without any capability to distinguish information integrity from corruption. A leaked Facebook document describes its artificial intelligence hub as ingesting trillions of data points each day to produce thousands of models and 6 million behavioral predictions per second. That is what I mean by volume and industrial scale. Meaning, facts, and truth are simply not in the picture. And why? Because in the logic of surveillance capitalism, information integrity has no bearing on revenues. On the contrary, as we have seen all too painfully, corrupt information has proven quite good for business as it drives more extraction. The system demands our engagement, but it is radically indifferent to what engages us. This structural blindness to information integrity has produced an eternal Christmas morning for every autocratic power, oligarch, political bad actor, troll farm, state-sponsored or grassroots disinformation campaign, now able to sidestep the blind side and inject whatever they please into the global information bloodstream without sanction. Thus empowered, these same actors refuse to let journalists stand in their way as machine systems drive revenue by vaulting corrupt information into the very center of social discourse, extinguishing all vestiges of an autonomous public square. From the ancestral disciplines of oral witness to the traumatic shift from the spoken to the written word, to the institutionalization of the fourth estate, each turn in the material history of information and communication asserted standards of information integrity and the means of enforcing those standards. Until now. Instead, what we have witnessed is the alienation of news content from institutional zones of public and professional laws, rules, norms, and standards. And this has produced conditions that no democracy can survive. Most poignant is how news organizations have had to submit to surveillance capitalism in order to survive. I'm struck by the fact that as early as 2011, in the Pew Research's annual report on the state of the news media that year, the report observed, quote, "The future will belong to those who understand the public's changing behavior and can target content and advertising to snugly fit the interests of each user. That knowledge and the expertise in gathering it increasingly resides with technology companies outside of journalism." My friends, we have stumbled into a future that we did not and would not choose. Ours is an accidental dystopia, a global zero-sum game in which the deepening order of surveillance capitalism produces deepening democratic disorder, eroding the social fabric as the prelude to a wider contest over the politics of knowledge in our emerging civilization. We were too complacent. We were too apathetic. We took democracy and its institutions of the fourth estate for granted. We did not understand the fragility
and the threats, we did not fight. We allowed ourselves to be bystanders. However, this tide has turned. I stand before you today more optimistic than I have ever been that the democratic order and journalism's renewed centrality to that order will win this contest. All roads now lead through politics, collective action, and lawmaking. The last 3 years have been marked by a largely unheralded but powerful sea change on these very frontiers. In America, in Europe, and in nearly every world region, there has been a wholesale rupture of the public's faith in the tech companies and the future they seek to impose. Tech employees are finally breaking ranks in record numbers, and lawmakers are on the move for the first time with a steady crescendo of legislative initiatives, even in a once reluctant America. And I'm so pleased that we're having this gathering today, because it was just last week that the European Union added rocket fuel to this mix with a powerful political agreement on the Digital Services Act. This legislation represents a bold reckoning with history, the first comprehensive declaration of a democratic digital future founded on the legitimate authority of democratic rights and rule of law. The DSA breaks the sound barrier of surveillance capitalism's aura of inevitability and invincibility. It asserts that the digital must live in democracy's house. It means that for the first time in 2 decades, there is hope that the principles of a self-governing demos might survive the digital century. This 3rd decade that we have entered must be a crucial turning point when we set ourselves on the long overdue work of reinvention, not simply regulation. We need to reckon with the most basic questions of how to reinvent our connected information domains in order that they advance the aspirations and ideals of democratic societies. This means new charters of rights and new laws to oversee them, and new institutions purpose-built for our time to govern their application, all under the rule of public law. The next years will be tough, requiring unflinching muscle and determination. And though surveillance capitalism is the younger challenger, it embodies many novel strengths that have been rapidly transformed into reliable means. But the corporations do not hold all the cards. And the young entrepreneurial pioneers of the internet, once hailed as heroes, are now more like addled, aging emperors, unhinged by the absolute power that our democracies bestowed upon them. While democracy may be the old and slow incumbent, it brings advantages that are difficult to rival. These include the ability to inspire democratic action, to inspire fear in adversaries, and most formidable, the legitimate authority and requisite power to make, to impose, and to enforce the democratic rule of law based on cherished values, ideals, and principles. In closing, it teaches us that whatever has been made by people can be unmade by people when we stand together. Thank you so much. A privilege to be with you here today.
Thank you so much, Professor Zuboff, for this in-depth analysis. Please stay with us. We have now the first round of questions to our distinguished panel. We're going to be talking about the digital challenges for journalists today.
Le pido por favor a los oradores que están acá presentes, el doctor Marcelo.
Dr. Marcelo Bechara, Director of Institutional Relations for Global Group, a member of the Broadcasters Association. Claudia Duque, research journalist from Colombia. She has received many journalist awards. And Irene Khan, Special UN Rapporteur on the promotion of freedom of expression. In this ceremony, we have listened to the President and UN authorities. They've spoken about transparency, democracy, freedom of expression, surveillance, moratorium on software, espionage, journalist attacks. And now we're going to go deeper into some of these topics. The Irene Khan, and it is an honor to have you here in Uruguay. Thank you so much for traveling, UN Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression. The first question, considering the increasing sophistication and the impossibility to detect malware and spyware as they're being used against journalists and human rights defenders by so many state actors and non-state actors, do you think that this is really endangering free and independent journalism?
Or please.
Thank you.
We need interpretation.
My apologies. I'm not as proficient in Spanish as I'm sure you are in English. Well, actually, what we see happening is very dangerous. Like the data theft of digital platforms that Professor Zuboff was talking, because it all happens without knowledge, without awareness, without a click. Technology has progressed to such an extent that this surveillance that takes place, and here we are now talking about targeted surveillance, not data theft, but targeted surveillance of journalists, are taking place with a technology that moves into their equipment without them even realizing it. And they can see, they can hear, they can collect any data that they want. And what does that do? It destroys journalism, because journalism needs to have freedom to be able to investigate and collect information. And very importantly, it destroys the trust of journalistic sources, because they are also put into danger. Now, the companies that provide these tools tell us that they are only selling it to states for lawful use, and states tell us that they're using it only for lawful surveillance of crime and terrorism. But we know, thanks to the research, thanks to the publication, that actually hundreds of journalists, human rights defenders, and activists have been subjected to this. And I want to point out the gender dimension of it. The information that is being collected, the conversations that women journalists have had, the data about where they live, what they do, is then used in smear campaigns and in endangering their safety. So it is a form of gender-based violence as well against women. And the consequences can be disastrous. It can lead to people being killed, attacked, imprisonment, abuse, and of course, intimidation. So it really kills journalists. And it also happens across territories. So it's not only in your own country. We know that the clients of NSO can operate across, and other companies operate across borders. So it is also extraterritorial, which makes it very difficult to seek protection from. And remember, this is not happening in isolation. It's happening in the context of other pressures that journalists face. So it's a very, very dangerous trend.
Thank you very much. La siguiente pregunta es para Claudia Duque.
The next question is addressed to Claudia Duque. Considering your career and the attacks that you have suffered as a journalist, the question is, do you see any links, do you see any ties between digital attacks and the attacks that we suffer in real life, so to speak? Yes, I've been working this for over 20 years, where unfortunately I have suffered firsthand the development of technology and the way in which such development affects and has an impact in persecution methods that we as journalists are subjected to. 20 years ago, in 2001, I was kidnapped. And while I was kidnapped, I was told that my kidnappers knew exactly what I did, what I was doing, what I was working on, and they threatened me. They threatened me because of the research that I was undertaking. In 2003, 2004, I was tortured. I suffered psychological torture that now it's been proved thanks to evidence that I provided, and emails and phone calls, and that evidence that every single word of those threats that I received that qualify as torture are based on very specific analysis that Colombian Secret Service would do to really be able to reach their destination and to end my aspirations in the country. Today, in 2021, 20 years later, under a protection program of the Colombian government, that it is considered a protection mechanism, a very robust mechanism, and the most robust in the world, we discovered how the bulletproof car that I was provided with for my protection was equipped inside with different espionage devices. So this has become a mobile espionage vehicle, so you can be followed through all of the GPS devices that were fitted inside, that are connected with any system, any device that you might have, Wi-Fi modem, drones, cell phones. It will connect for greater accuracy and geolocalization. And in the first 6 months of the pandemic, where we were, most of us, locked down, they were able to gather over 25,000 pieces of data on my movements. They can also shut down the vehicle remotely. They can unlock the vehicle remotely. They can block all transmission signs, so I could issue no warnings or no alerts. So who are we subjected to in this protection mechanism? Under this mechanism, I was told that all of these instruments were for my own protection, but really I was not told that this was going on. And when I asked for an informed consent, I was asked to be treated under Colombian law and international treaties, but I was told that once you are protected, you are disclosing your privacy, and that nothing would happen because that information would only be made available to the government ruling this program. Actually, this program inherited 600 staff from the former Secret Service in the country, the Secret Service that had subjected me to these activities. So to gather 3,000 pages of evidence many years ago, you needed a large staff, you needed to tap phones and so on. But now to gather 25,000 pieces of data in 6 months, and the family, where you go, who your sources are, and everything that you do, it can be done in real time. And in addition to these vehicles have equipment that can capture footage, can record your conversations inside or out the vehicle, and it is also fitted with sensors and cameras, which through infrared technology can register how many people there are in the vehicle. And there are also very small devices that we really don't even see, collect thousands of data across the 6 months of the pandemic. So the government really hid information from me, and they compiled information without my knowing. And they're saying that the state is also saying that they have that much amount of information for the past 10 years. So I cannot even imagine how much information they have kept on myself. I am not a drug dealer. I am not a criminal. So I wonder, why would the state do this with someone who is supposedly a protected person? We have over 4,000 protected people in Colombia, over 100 of these who are journalists. So I have been a victim of persecution for many years, and new technologies have really made it easier for states to do so. They go unpunished, and it is more socially acceptable now to do so, or even legally accepted, because the judges in the country say exactly the same thing, that we should thank the fact that we are under a protection program, and therefore we have to hand over our right to privacy, as privacy would be considered as a lesser right. And this is a favor that they are doing to us, and that they are going to guard these data. But really, I have no access to my own personal data, only they do. In 2015, for example, an armed man followed me. He was carrying my picture, and he really had available GPS data. I could clearly see it. In February, I was a victim of intimidation while I was driving a vehicle. And on that same day, at the National Protection Unit, they were able to follow my every second and my localization. So I know there is a link between, and the fact that it goes unpunished is what I think is worse. It's not just about private companies anymore, but rather the states are using these technologies and the judges who accept it. George Orwell couldn't have said it better. He couldn't have imagined it.
You're the head of WhatsApp, and one of the platforms that we journalists use every day, human rights activists use every day. Encryption and private messaging is very, very important, as we were just listening to Claudia Duque's testimony. What is your perspective on the threats encryption faces around the world? Mr. Cathcart?
Mr. Cathcart, are you there?
Okay, he's good.
Can you guys hear me?
¿Me escuchan?
Some technical difficulties. Yeah. First of all,
Tenemos
thank you
ciertas
so much for
dificultades.
Yeah, we think encryption is incredibly important for not just journalists. It's especially important for journalists, but really for everyone. So for those that don't know, WhatsApp uses end-to-end encryption, which means when you send a message on WhatsApp, we can't see it. It's secure and only goes to whoever you sent it to. And if you just think about how much people are using messaging services to have sensitive, private conversations, talking to their doctors, to their loved ones, sending things like business plans or financial information, it's incredibly important that it be secure and that they don't need to choose to share that content, share that message with a private company. But this is especially important for journalists. I mean, Special Rapporteur Khan talked about the dangers of spyware and how horrifying it is that journalists are being targeted for their private sensitive communications, which undermines, as she pointed out, the trust sources have in talking to journalists. It undermines the ability for whistleblowers to talk to a journalist, which in the end undermines journalism and undermines our ability to have a free society where people in power are held to account and held to check. So it's incredibly important. Unfortunately, we are seeing a lot of pressure from different governments around the world against end-to-end encryption. Sometimes this comes up very overtly, where a government will ask for a backdoor. So they will ask for the ability to read anyone's private message. There's no way to create a way for a government to read it, but not expose a security hole for a spyware company or a hostile government or foreign government to read someone's messages. But sometimes governments will ask for other things, like the ability to scan for only certain types of content. They'll say, we don't need to see everything, but please go and detect, be it maybe terrorism or more recently child safety content that's inappropriate or illegal or heinous, and block just that. Well, once you've done that, you've created a way to scan the private conversations people are having. And we've seen calls from some governments for a concept called traceability, which is tell us who first said something. Tell us who first said this thing that was inappropriate, but also could be who first said this first thing that was politically undesirable. And we're seeing this all around the world. We're seeing in the UK, the government has been very vocal about opposition to encryption at times. They're discussing right now the Online Safety Act. We've seen in Brazil at times calls for the concept of traceability and things like fake news legislation. We've seen in India a mandate requiring companies to do traceability. We've challenged that mandate in court as inconsistent with the privacy guarantees of the Indian Constitution. And recently we've seen calls in the EU for scanning for child sexual abuse material. So everywhere we're seeing this, the message I hope to deliver, and I know many of you here are already loud about this, which we're grateful for, but the message I hope to deliver is weakening encryption, no matter how noble the goal might be you're trying to solve, weakening encryption hurts everyone. There is no magic solution to weakening encryption that would help only good guys and not bad guys. And when you look at how important encryption is for the work journalists do, as well as human rights defenders and civil society and everyone, we think weakening it would be a tragic mistake. So grateful for all the work everyone is doing to be vocal about this. I do think it requires people and organizations speaking up. We're proud to support the new Alliance for Encryption in Latin America and the Caribbean, proud to support the Global Encryption Coalition and all the people around the world who are fighting for this. We'd love to get to a place where we're also seeing governments loudly support encryption. I think it is unfortunate that our experience right now is with governments mostly pushing us to weaken security. I would love to get to a place where governments are pushing private companies to have even stronger security and collect even less data than they normally would. So we could use everyone's help being loud about this, and in particular, the impact it has on journalism all around the world. Thank you, and thank you again for having me.
Another issue we're going to talk about is artificial intelligence. And for that, my question is to Timnit Gebru. She's an expert on the issue. Artificial intelligence is being used for surveillance of journalist movements, trolling of journalists, especially women. It's been used to attack minority groups, women, among others. So my question to you is, what is the impact of artificial intelligence on freedom of expression?
For this question, I'm seeing the intersection of so many things in this issue that we're talking about, and hearing the experiences of all these journalists, some of whom I'm actually collaborating with. So there is the intersection of racism, colonialism, and as Karen Howe, who used to be reporter at the MIT Tech Review, has this series called AI Colonialism. And of course, as Shoshana Zuboff's book discusses surveillance capitalism. So there is all of this intersection with AI that, or are right now specifically deep learning methods that require lots and lots of data that are labeled, often by people who are completely exploited, have absolutely no rights. So there was just an article recently about content moderators who indirectly work for Facebook in Kenya, and how they were exploited and barely paid. I'm talking about less than $5,000 a year. And so it's like a reincarnation of colonialism in my opinion. And there is a lot more that hasn't been said on that end. There is this ideology, almost like a religious ideology, that is very popular among all of the billionaires right now, including Elon Musk, etc., called long-termism, where it's all about artificial general intelligence and how we should maximize future human potentials, and at the cost of current human potential. And if you really read up on it, it's to me a reincarnation of modern day eugenics. So there is a lot happening here at the intersection of AI, racism, colonization, and what we're talking about in terms of journalism under attack, to me, is under that. So for instance, when I was at Google, I also happen to be born and raised in Ethiopia, and I'm of Eritrean descent. And Eritrea is the world's most censored country, the lowest internet penetration rate. And in Ethiopia, there is a genocide in Tigray right now, where over 500,000 people have died. So on the one hand, we have that the media has really not covered this, something that should be front page of every news. On the other hand, we have people who are using social media to raise awareness, but then we also have this transnational repression that is going on, where this kind of dictators have thrown their tentacles across nations, and a lot of journalists have are self-censoring. So my colleague calls this mute news. So one of my colleagues that I hired at Google at the very end, right before I got fired, is Moroccan, and he's actually somebody who is a victim of this transnational repression. And his friends who are journalists like Omar Radi were one of the first people to be victims of the Pegasus spyware, etc. So what I'm saying is all of us AI researchers, many of us are at the intersections of these things, and we've been trying to raise the alarm. And when we raise the alarm, we get retaliated against, right? So collective action is key. In terms of AI specifically, the intersection of the scale that everybody wants to have. So in social media networks, for instance, you have all of these people that are unpaid laborers, right? Doing the kind of the labeling of raising the alarm of misinformation, etc., who are unpaid. They're not making money. And so if we had a situation where the data laborers behind all of these systems, whether it's social media networks or other forms of quote unquote AI, then these companies wouldn't rush to adopt all of these systems, because it wouldn't make sense market-wise to scale, because you're paying the appropriate amount to these data people who are actually powering these quote-unquote automated systems, because they're not truly automated. There's a whole army of people who are not being compensated for, who are labeling this data. So that's kind of my, what I would say, which is at the heart of it. And as I've been raising the alarm about a new crop of models called large language models that actually generate language, and they can generate it at generate certain kinds of text. They can generate it at scale. They can sound super coherent. So now you can start to see even more of this extremist ideology or misinformation that is coupled with social media platforms, and that is kind of proliferated everywhere. And just like deepfakes, so deepfakes are images or videos or audio that can be generated, and we see on social media a lot of people with social media accounts with faces that are generated, fake faces that are generated with deepfakes, that then assume certain kinds of personalities and harass journalists and others. I've been harassed too. And so you can see, imagine this language that's generated in conjunction with this fake images and audio that are generated being proliferated. But at the same time, a lot of experts on misinformation talk about, even if you don't see a lot of these fake generated texts, just the notion, the fact that they exist can be a really big problem, because people can say everything is fake when they want to suppress dissent, right? So that's also the other issue. So for me, this is at the intersection of the new colonial order that AI is creating. So I really highly suggest reading Karen Howe's a series on that. The labor practices that are so exploitative that come with this extractive colonial order, because the data laborers are not getting paid. And if they were, all of these companies would not rush to adopt these techniques. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Timnit. Ahora volvemos a la perspectiva de los...
Let us go back to the media with Dr. Bishara, who is Director of Institutional Relations of the O Global Group. The question is, what do you think is the impact in media operations of surveillance, trolling, online attacks regulation of private information for journalists as a manner.
It's a pleasure to talk with experts that I admire at most. Well, there is not journalism that is under siege. It's democracy itself. That's what we're talking about. All human activities, from agriculture to religion, are being impacted for digital revolution since the beginning of in the middle of the 90s, when the commercial internet exploded. And journalism is not different, because it's pure communication. In the past, journalists used to have the monopoly of information. It's not bad at all, because there was method, a technique, that is professionalism. With the Web 2.0 and social media, everyone can be a kind of, a sort of journalist. And we are facing now a different time with the threat of democracy and the rise of authoritarianism, that they are targeting journalism, a people's enemy. Who really believes that the journalists are people's enemy? And there is, so media companies and media outlets, yes, has the responsibility to protect their professionals. What we must have is a global journalism shield, a global journalism protection. That's what we need. That's what we need to discuss. In the case of the company that I work for, Global, we have a huge and a big program, and it's a mandatory program for all the employees, including, of course, journalists, to learn and to engage in the culture of security of information. We have, of course, specific and channels for whistleblowers, ombudsmen, in order to make any kind of denounce of attacks against journalists, not only in virtual space, but in real space, because all this strange time that we're living now, when we come first with the isolation of social media, then turns to intolerance. The intolerance, the third pace is violence, and the last is barbarian. And we are close to barbarian. We are very close to barbarian. Not only in Brazil, but everybody, every place we go, we're so divided, we're so angry. And what makes this in the same level around all the world was the pandemic. Because the pandemic was a global event. So the pandemic put everybody in the same place. Everybody was afraid, everybody was isolated. And the infodemia becomes bigger and bigger and shows the problem that we are facing. And we in a kind of resgate the importance of journalism. I don't know if you know, but in Brazil, the official data, we don't have official data from the government saying how many people are sick, ill, or die of COVID-19. We have made a concert of media outlets to collect these numbers and shows every day for the Brazilian people. So what we're talking is that the journalism, and I agree with the professor, I'm optimistic about this moment, journalism is resurging in a new way. It's different, it's hard, it's painful, but it's a new way. And we have to create measures to protect them. And it's, yes, the responsibility of media outlets and media companies to do that. It used to be it's not really something new. It's different. It's more powerful. Surveillance is not new. It's not something digital. It happens since everywhere. We live here in a region, Uruguay, Brazil, Chile, Argentina, that in the 70s and 80s, we faced the dictatorship. And at the time, censor was to make, it's all about silence. Censor is to make about silences, silence voices. Now it's the opposite. Censorship is about screaming and screaming loud, and millions and millions of voices screaming fake news, misinformation, and trying to confuse the public opinion. So media literacy and information literacy and media education are so important, and it is a role of the media companies to fight against these million voices that are trying to confuse the public opinion. So yes, we have this responsibility, and we have to unite forces and maybe create what I'm calling this global journalism shield, a worldwide protection, to create mechanisms, not only social mechanisms, but technological mechanisms. The big techs, they have the responsibility to provide us some of these tools. And more, we have to talk about the sustainability of media. It's not a discussion here from taxis against Ubers that say we are old and you are new. No, we're talking about the professionalism of information. And our information, the information that the journalists produce, is the content that social media use to make profit. So it's reasonable they can pay for the use of this information. They pay professionals, they pay journalists, they pay media outlets. So I believe we have to see what is happening in Australia, what is happening in part of Europe, what is happening now in Canada, and the discussion that we are having in the fake news bills in Brazil that is trying to address this issue of make media more sustainable. With media more sustainable, media more healthy, we are making journalism more healthy. And with journalism more healthy, we have democracy. Thanks.
Muchas gracias, doctor Bellara.
Thank you.
Y después de esta primera...
And after this first round of questions and answers, we will try to find solutions. And Dr. Bellara, I will start with you again, and I will ask you all, please, to provide very brief questions. Maybe keep it under a minute. And you did mention something in this regard, but what do you think is the role that employers play in making sure that there is a digital security for journalists, even freelance journalists? And what would be the role of security heads in the press room?
I believe the companies and the professionals, they have to unite themselves and create programs, specific programs of protection. And the government has, we have to trust in some kind of government or part of the government, but the government itself, they have to provide solutions in order to protect this kind of activity that is so important for democracy. In our case, we are so engaged in providing our professionals all the tools. Thanks in Brazil, we don't have the Ukrainian situation, but we have the surveillance situation, of course, and threats to journalists. So we provide a protection with programs and education, and we try to train all these professionals to deal with the situation. We have a kind of a crisis offices in order to protect. We have some situations, and all the situations this professional is, and his family, of course, or his or her family, are involved and protected. And we believe we need to collaborate with police forces and government, because not only the company itself, but also the state is responsible for protecting this activity.
So now my question is to Timnit Gebru. Back to you. Last year, UNESCO adopted what is known as a first global normative instrument on the ethics of artificial intelligence. It talks about international law. It talks about the right to privacy, among other things. How do you think that these recommendations, how this ethics should be implemented? What are your recommendations on this?
Make sure I understand, because it was going in and out a bit. So you're asking me about the UNESCO recommendations on ethics?
That's correct.
And what I think.
And how you would implement, such recommendations. How should countries around the world, how should journalists around the world implement it?
Yeah, I'm hearing my echo, so maybe we could mute one of the things.
Yeah,
let me try to mute something.
How do you suggest implementing the recommendations on artificial intelligence around the world?
Perfect, now I can hear it. So I think the problem is that there are a lot of these, what do you call, guidelines that companies, large tech companies have. So for instance, after an uproar of a project called Maven at Google, they wrote some guidelines. But the problem is that they become what people call ethics washing. These guidelines are not really followed. They're very vague. So at the heart of a lot of, I've been going on this rabbit hole for a long time. Some of my work relates to math, so, kind of attacking the problem mathematically. Some of my work is about documentation, etc. But at the heart of it, in my opinion, is exactly what Shoshana Zuboff wrote about, surveillance capitalism. And at the heart of it is the exploitation of labor and extractive practices. So as long as labor protections are not front and center, and as long as people can have, whether it's, like for instance, this article I mentioned about Kenyan, content moderators in Kenya being exploited, or in the US, people who are unable to speak up against unethical practices. In my opinion, as long as we don't have that kind of protection, no kind of ethical guidelines that we have will be followed, because people will be too scared to speak up, or they'll be retaliated against when they speak up, like I was. So whatever kind of guidelines we have to have enforcement, some sort of enforcement mechanisms, and I think at the heart of that is protection of labor practices. So I'm not sure if that wholly answers your question, but that's really my point of view on this matter. I can actually share an op-ed I wrote saying exactly those things in the chat, and maybe some people can read it later.
Thank you very much. Our next question is going to be with Mr. Cathcart from WhatsApp. We're seeing an alarming increase of mal and spyware around the world being used against human rights activists, against journalists. What is a company like WhatsApp doing in order to help people protect itself or protect its users? Could you talk to us a little bit about that? And we don't have a lot of time, so sorry to be rushing.
No, I'll be brief. Yeah, this is a terrifying trend. I think it has reached a crisis that there is an out-of-control spyware industry that is targeting journalists and human rights defenders by selling their exploits all around the world. We all, at this point, carry a phone in our pocket everywhere. The idea that someone could hack into it and listen to us going about our days, terrifying for everyone, but especially journalists. This is not new for us. So what we've been doing, we detected an attack from the NSO group in 2019. We obviously defeated the attack and continued to add security to WhatsApp to make it harder for them to hack through us. But we wanted to do more than that. And so we worked with the Citizen Lab organization out of the University of Toronto to understand everything we could about the attack, understand everything we could about Pegasus and also the victims, and to reach out to them directly, to have Citizen Lab talk to the journalists and human rights defenders who've been targeted so they knew what they could do. But we also wanted to do more to raise awareness around the problem. So we went public with what we learned. We joined the Special Rapporteur's call for a moratorium on the spyware industry. And we've sued NSO Group in US court for the attack. I believe that the increased scrutiny that is coming from groundbreaking reporting all around the world, every week you hear about more completely shocking cases of abuse from spyware. I think that's incredibly important to put scrutiny on the industry and ultimately to create consequences. Tech companies can and should do everything they can to make their products secure. But at the end of the day, there will always be a market for surveillance. There will always be a market to abuse journalists. And there needs to be more than just technological barriers. There need to be consequences. The way this stops is if spyware companies and the people who abuse spyware get in trouble. And so everything everyone is doing to raise attention to the issue, especially journalists all around the world, is critically important for creating that accountability and for getting governments involved. Recently, the Biden administration put NSO Group on a sanctions list, so US companies cannot do business with them. That is a good first step, but there need to be a lot more consequences.
Hello. Yeah. Thank you very much. Dr. Khan, we have seen last year the amount of exposés about surveillance, about technology available, about what is happening. And you're one of the persons around the world, of the experts around the world, proposing this moratorium on the transfer and sale of technology. How could something like this be implemented? I mean, it seems very, very difficult, or something difficult to achieve. I mean, what do you suggest?
It is difficult to achieve, but that doesn't mean we should not try. And that is because it's very important. What a moratorium effectively is, a global moratorium, is just freezing the sale, transfer, and use until proper rules are put into place. Now, as a lawyer, I believe in law. I believe in rights. Ethics are fine. We need them. But ethical standards and guidelines are not going to fix the problem here. The purpose of the moratorium is that we need to stop. We all know now, especially now that we know, thanks to all the work that journalists have done and researchers and others, we now know how damaging it is to have this kind of digital targeted surveillance. People are being killed, lives are being destroyed, international relations have been affected, as we know, and of course public trust is being lost. So knowing all that, do we just let this continue while we seek to fix the problem? No. We should have a ban put into place while we fix the problem. And what do I mean by fixing the problem? I think a lot of responsibility has to lie with governments, individually and collectively. They need to introduce, governments need to take seriously their human rights obligations. You see, the reason why I'm skeptical about ethics is because we have a framework. We heard the High Commissioner for Human Rights talk about a legal framework that exists, and that is the framework for human rights. Use that and strengthen national laws. There are rules about when governments can surveil and when they cannot. It has to be done for very limited purposes. It has to be proportionate. It has to be necessary. And then introduce independent oversight of the use of surveillance by governments, whether it's a judicial body or a quasi-judicial body, strong one, and provide remedies. Mr. Cathcart talked about litigation. It's very difficult to litigate this issue because you don't have the evidence. You know, this is an industry that operates in a very opaque manner. So there must be clear remedies. And I would argue that there must be a very high bar that governments have to cross if they want to surveil human rights defenders or journalists or certain categories of people. Because what they're saying is they're going to use tools that are meant for criminals, that are meant for terrorists against human rights defenders, people like me, journalists like you. Then let the government go in front of an independent body and prove why. So there has to be a very high standard. So there are certain national things that have to happen. I also think that export control has to be brought in here with a human rights orientation. To whom are these types of tools being sold? It has been done for landmines, it's been done for small arms. So I think this kind of technology should fall into that category. I commend Costa Rica for having actually introduced a moratorium, and I would encourage Costa Rica to work with other states in this region to expand that moratorium. The European Parliament has now set up a committee of inquiry to investigate. The Indian Supreme Court has set up an inquiry, so we can see that what journalists have done, what researchers have done, exposure and disclosure is leading to some action, and we have to keep pushing, and we have to keep the pressure on that. And then, of course, when it comes to corporations, don't just believe that corporations that work in this kind of a business will just become good and do it. Regulation has to come with teeth. Regulate them, but then make sure that there are consequences if they break the regulation.
Thank you very much.
Bien. Y ahora también.
Now, running after you, Claudia, as a journalist that has been abused, what do you think about those solutions being proposed? Okay, just a minute to say that the idea of the moratorium is excellent. Anyhow, I think the key word is accountability. And how do we reach it? First, making states reckon that the violations related with the right of privacy and intimacy are major crimes. Most legislations in the world believe this felony. And we must begin to granting more importance to this. That is the most massive violation of human rights we're suffering now as citizens, not only journalists. So it requires to be reclassified and considered a major crime. This will lead to investigations and penal sanctions, not only civil sanctions, because it's quite easy to manage to be reimbursed for a violation due to privacy as compared to a conviction due to a crime, because it's considered felony. And at judicial level, there's a real lack of knowledge about the meaning and the connection there is between violating the privacy of a journalist and then torturing, killing, and kidnapping them. On the other hand, I think it's good to speak of public policies, but these public policies must be made into real guidelines and administrative resolutions so that the officials ultimately stop with this practice of invading our privacy, be it with the excuse of protection or the suspicion that because we're critical, that's wrong. On the other hand, private companies and corporations such as WhatsApp, Twitter, Facebook, must work harder in relation to stopping these practices, because some accounts are promoting hate speech and also working against us, investigating us and threatening us, a death threat. I received one last week due to an opinion I had in relation to something happening in our country. So I think accountability isn't only saying, and something else that is very important. In the contracts with the private companies, we should eliminate the confidentiality clause, because we can't be ignorant of many facts, such as the price and many more things. They're only promoting sales and marketing of technology, attacking human rights defenders and journalists, and that goes unpunished. We should work with the private companies not only to strengthen vulnerabilities or preventing somebody from hacking your systems. These companies must also be transparent with the general public, citizens, and journalists, showing their contracts so we can really know about NSO, not what governments purchase their software, but for what uses. And so we're aware about the GPS installed in the different vehicles and to what satellites they're sending the information and to which companies are selling the information. I think those contracts are really a cause of shame, and that in this world, as Marcelo said now, this is in the name of freedom, of liberty. Everybody's informing through Twitter or whatever, but this is a real mix-up, transforming us into the slaves of companies, and it could belong to Elon Musk or whoever, but what I really care for is that these platforms be clear about who in government is using our information, because it isn't only an issue of marketing, that it is, or of controlling our taste, and it is, but it's also related to the direct safety of the people conducting journalism in this context. Thank you so much.
Just information, really. I mean, this really makes a difference. Thank you very much. Let's all stand up. We're gonna. Muchísimas gracias. Thank you.
Gracias.
So please stay with us. We have a high-level segment now. We're also going to be giving away the Guillermo Cano Awards ceremony. And please, please share this conversation online on your social media networks with the hashtag World Press Freedom Day. Thank you. Please stay seated. We have a high-level segment now. For those who are interested, it's important for those of you to be here.
Querido Luis Lacalle Pou, presidente del Uruguay.
Dear Luis Lacalle Pou, President of Uruguay, Honorable Mrs. Audrey Azoulay, Director-General of UNESCO, Excellencies, Costa Rica is extremely pleased about the World Conference celebrating the World Free Press Day